A record number of people worldwide were displaced last year, according to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre. Its research shows nearly 76 million people were forced from their homes. Most were displaced by conflict and violence, others by natural disasters. Nearly half were in Africa. The UN says the conflict in Sudan has caused the world's worst displacement crisis. This report says that by the end of last year, more than 9 million people had been forced to flee. Israel's war on Gaza forcibly displaced 1.7 million people in the 3 months between October and December. And 4.7 million people in Turkey and Syria are living in temporary shelters and containers after devastating earthquakes there. Barbara Angopa reports.
A watchdog says war drove global displacement to a record 76 million people last year. The report from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre says the number of displaced people doubled in the last 5 years. These Palestinians arriving at Al-Mawasi area on Gaza's western coast have been on the move since Israel's war on Gaza began in October.
We've been displaced 4 times and now we live with my uncle's family in Al-Mawasi, but there is no space for us here.
Violence in Gaza, Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo drove 2/3 of the displacements in 2023. In the final quarter of the year, Israel's war on Gaza forcibly displaced 1.7 million Palestinians. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, fighting between government troops and rebels uprooted 6.7 million people. Since the conflict in Sudan started in April, 9.1 million people have been driven from their homes, the second highest number recorded in a single country since records began in 2008. 4-year-old Yasmin was orphaned as her family tried to escape from Sudan to Chad during fighting between rival forces.
Her mother, who was 8 months pregnant, was killed and she was left all alone. Some people found her on the road and brought her back here. On the road, we suffered a lot. The Rapid Support Forces killed and wounded so many people.
But the report says the crisis is just the tip of the iceberg. Tens of millions of people remain displaced from previous and ongoing wars and disasters. Extreme weather and natural disasters also contributed to the global spike of internally displaced people. Floods, storms, earthquakes and wildfires displaced more than 26 million people. Barbara Angopa, Al Jazeera.
Let's focus on the case of Sudan. Sara Pantuliano is the chief executive of the think tank Overseas Development Institute. You also led the UN Development Programme's Sudan Peacebuilding Unit, and you're joining us from London. Thank you for your time today. Start by describing what life is like for internally displaced people in Sudan.
So as the report your colleague just mentioned, this is the worst, the largest internal displacement crisis. Of these 9 million, 7 million people are displaced within Sudan. Just to give you a sense, the population of Khartoum a year ago was 6 million people. Now only 1 million remain. People are on the move all the time. They have to flee and flee again. We know that 750,000 people have crossed into Chad. That includes 200,000, almost 100,000, that were Chadian refugees, so people that left Chad to seek refuge in Darfur and now have fled again because the violence in Darfur is so horrible. And what we know is that the level of the violence is what terrifies people more than anything. Human Rights Watch documented that last year there's been pretty much ethnic cleansing against the Masai tribe in Darfur. So it's the violence, is the fear of being killed, of course, but it's also the hunger crisis, because we are seeing the threat of famine in Sudan on levels that we haven't seen for many, many years. And we have seen famine before in the country, so we know what to expect.
I'd like for our viewers to get an understanding of the long-term impact of something like this. When we say that there have been 6 million displacements over the course of just 1 year, as was the case in Sudan, that affects, it's 6 million people for that year, but it actually affects them for many, many, many years to come, if not for their entire life.
Absolutely. It's actually 9 million people, 6.7
Right.
are only those who are within the country. The rest fled across the borders. And yes, we know that, crisis, when a displacement crisis where people don't go back to their homes for 6 months, they are likely to remain in displacement for 3 years. We know that if they stay away for more than a year, they won't be back for 5. And if they stay away for 3, they won't be back for 10 and probably will never go back. So all these figures are well established. We have done a lot of research on these things to the eye over the years. So we know what to expect. And what people need to imagine is what it means to be, uprooted for such a long time, for kids not to be able to go back to school, not to be in education, obviously for, the productive activities to completely stall, to completely halt and not be able to be resumed. But obviously what we're most concerned about right now is not the long term, it's the immediate term. And as I was saying before, we are seeing so many parts of the countries at levels of food insecurity are extremely high. Food insecurity is calculated on a range from 1 to 5. And last December, we already had a lot of areas of Sudan that were in phase 4, which is emergency, and then moving into catastrophe. The Security Council was just briefed last month about the imminent danger of a catastrophic famine in Sudan.
Yeah, the phases of food insecurity are something we've become quite familiar with on Al Jazeera, whether it's in Sudan, whether it's in Gaza. Phase 4 or 5, for our viewers, for context for our viewers here, it's based on how much food you have, how nutritious the food is that you are eating. If people are eating, grass, as we've seen in some cases, that's not nutritious enough. It doesn't sustain you. It doesn't sustain life. And it's also how many people actually die of these food shortages. You mentioned children. There's a knock-on effect for the next generation, of course.
No, absolutely. I mean, talking about children, UNICEF predicts that 700,000 children will die in Sudan this year alone. Even if we manage to act now to prevent the famine, these children will die because we've already crossed the thresholds, in terms of morbidity, and it will be impossible to save them. But of course, as you say, for a lot of them, the impact will be long-term, the inability to be educated, the trauma of the violence that is not addressed, the fact that we will for many years continue to live in makeshift, displacement or refugee camps. I mean, that will obviously have lasting impacts for generations. And it's a bit what we have seen, to be honest, with some of the children that are the young soldiers, if you want, they are involved in perpetrating the violence today. These were the children of previous crises in Sudan that didn't have a future.
Yeah, they become vulnerable on so many levels. Sara Pantuliano, Chief Executive of Overseas Development Institute. Thank you very much.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.